Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we are stepping into one of the most astonishing moments of the 20th century, the fall of the Soviet Union. In the space of a few breathless years, a superpower that stretched across 11 time zones dissolved, and the map of the world was redrawn before millions of watching eyes. Flags changed. Borders shifted. Leaders rose and fell. And ordinary people woke up in new countries without ever moving their feet. This is a story of ambition and reform, of shortages and speeches, of courage in the streets and uncertainty in the halls of power. It is a story where nuclear arsenals remained, even as the state that built them slipped away, where old certainties cracked and something entirely new struggled to take shape. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, simply settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let the day drift a little further away. Allow your thoughts to slow as we trace the final years of a vast and complicated world. Let's begin. In December 1991, the Soviet Union vanished, and 15 countries emerged. One evening at the end of 1991, the world watched a state that had defined the Cold War simply stop existing. The change was not announced with fireworks or a battlefield surrender. It arrived through signatures, resignations, and a quiet swapping of symbols on official buildings. What had been one union became 15 governments with their own presidents, parliaments, and currencies to plan. Embassies had to decide which flag to raise. Athletes, pilots, and sailors had to learn which country they now represented. Maps in classrooms became outdated overnight. For ordinary families, the shift could feel unreal. Your hometown stayed in place, yet your passport, your laws, and your future were suddenly different. Few collapses have remade so much of the planet so quickly and so peacefully on paper. A failed August coup in 1991 cracked the empire in days. For 3 tense days in August, a small group of senior officials tried to rewind history. They claimed the country was in danger, so they announced an emergency committee and moved to seize control. The president was cut off from power while he was away from Moscow, and state television tried to project confidence with stiff statements and old footage. Tanks rolled into the capital, yet the plotters could not command belief. Crowds gathered anyway, not because it was safe, but because they sensed a turning point. Some soldiers refused orders. Some commanders waited, listening for which side would win. The coup collapsed under its own confusion, and its failure revealed something irreversible. If the hardliners could not restore authority with troops and fear, then the center no longer had real control. After that week, the Union's collapse accelerated like a falling domino line. The Berlin Wall fell, and Moscow's control over Eastern Europe unraveled fast. When the Berlin Wall opened, it was not only a German story. It was a signal that the post-war order was breaking apart. For decades, Moscow had treated Eastern Europe as a strategic buffer and an ideological showcase. Suddenly, people crossed checkpoints that had once been deadly boundaries. Governments that had relied on secret police and one-party rule began to wobble, then tip. What made the moment even more shocking was what did not happen. There was no repeat of earlier crackdowns that had crushed uprisings in previous decades. Without the threat of Soviet intervention, reform movements gained speed and confidence. Elections, protests, and negotiated transitions spread across the region in rapid succession. As those states pulled away, the Soviet Union lost prestige, leverage, and a major reason to appear unbreakable. The wall's fall became a loud announcement that fear had limits. A single line of people, the Baltic Way, linked three nations in protest. In late summer of 1989, people in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania carried out a protest that depended on coordination, patience, and courage. Around 2 million participants formed a human chain that stretched for hundreds of miles across three republics. It was time to mark the anniversary of a pact that had reshaped the region's fate decades earlier, and it turned historical memory into living action. Families brought children. Strangers held hands. Organizers relied on radio, local committees, and careful planning, because the state did not approve and could still punish. The message was simple and impossible to ignore. These republics saw themselves as nations with a stolen future. The world saw a demonstration that used bodies and unity instead of weapons. It was a masterclass in non-violent pressure, and it helped make independence feel not only possible, but inevitable. Chernobyl shattered trust, and secrecy stopped feeling like strength. When the reactor at Chernobyl exploded in 1986, radiation did not respect borders or slogans. Yet the first instinct of the system was silence. Officials delayed public warnings, controlled information, and tried to manage the story as if it were only a public relations problem. That choice became a second disaster, because it taught citizens that the state might hide danger even when lives were at risk. Firefighters and plant workers faced lethal exposure, while the wider public struggled to learn what was happening. In the weeks that followed, fear spread alongside rumors, and foreign reports often sounded more credible than local broadcasts. The catastrophe also created a paper trail of mistakes, cover-ups, and institutional weakness. Later reforms in openness gained urgency because people demanded truth, not reassurance. The accident became a turning point in public confidence, and it made many citizens feel that the system's greatest habit was also its greatest vulnerability. Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank, and the old order looked suddenly small. During the August crisis, one image traveled faster than any official announcement. A rival political leader climbed onto a tank outside the Russian parliament building and spoke directly to the crowd. The moment mattered because it flipped the script. Power was supposed to flow from party committees and security chiefs. Here it flowed from a public stance taken in full view, with cameras recording every word. The stand also changed the relationship between the Russian Republic and the Soviet center. By presenting himself as the defender of elected authority, he turned Moscow's streets into a stage where legitimacy could be claimed, not assigned. The defiance encouraged resistance, and it gave hesitant officials a reason to refuse cooperation with the crew leaders. After the crisis, momentum shifted toward the Russian presidency and away from union institutions. The scene showed millions that the old system could be challenged, and it could lose, in real time. The Communist Party lost its monopoly, and politics became unpredictable overnight. For most of Soviet history, politics meant one party and one permitted outcome. That changed when legal reforms ended the party's guaranteed dominance in government. Suddenly, public life gained something new and unsettling for a system built on control. Competition. People could organize movements, run for office, and criticize officials without automatic punishment, although risks remained. Debates that had once been private and scripted moved into open meetings and television broadcasts. Local races created surprise winners, and those winners built careers outside the party hierarchy. The shift also exposed divisions that had been hidden by discipline. Reformers argued with conservatives. National leaders argued with the center. Citizens discovered that their neighbors had different visions of the future. Uncertainty can be frightening, but it is also powerful. Once people experienced real choice, it became harder to accept a return to automatic obedience. The rules of the political game changed, and no one could predict the next move. Empty shelves and long queues made ideology feel less real than bread. A system can survive many arguments, but it struggles when daily life becomes a scavenger hunt. In the late Soviet years, shortages grew so common that shopping turned into a strategy. People traded favors, waited in lines that lasted for hours, and bought goods they did not need because they might not appear again. Some cities used ration coupons for basics, and families planned meals around whatever arrived that week. The paradox was painful. The country could build rockets and maintain a vast military, yet it could not reliably stock soap, meat, or shoes. The problem was not only production. Distribution broke down, and paperwork often mattered more than getting goods to kitchens. Frustration became political because it was personal. He could hear the collapse of confidence in the small talk of a queue. When people stop believing that tomorrow will be better stocked than today, promises start to sound like noise. Scarcity became a daily referendum on the system's competence. Republics declared sovereignty, and the center could not pull them back. As power weakened in Moscow, Republican parliaments began asserting that their laws mattered more than union decrees. This was not always a dramatic declaration of independence at first. Often it began as a claim over resources, budgets, language policy, or local security forces. Lawyers and legislators called it a battle of jurisdictions, and it created a real crisis of governance. If a factory sat in a republic, who owned it? If taxes were collected locally, who decided how they were spent? If police took orders from a Republican leader, what authority remained for union ministries? Each step encouraged the next, because the center rarely had an effective tool to enforce compliance without provoking outrage. The result was a gradual transfer of power that looked technical, yet felt revolutionary. Sovereignty declarations multiplied, and the union's institutions began to resemble empty shells. By the time the final breakup arrived, much of the control had already slipped away through legal and administrative cracks. The nuclear superpower remained armed, even as its government dissolved. One of the most chilling puzzles of the collapse involved weapons built for an apocalypse. The Soviet Union had created a vast nuclear arsenal with systems designed for centralized command. When the state began to fragment, the world had to consider an unprecedented question. What happens to doomsday weapons when the government that controls them is breaking apart? Military units still stood guard. Missiles still sat in silos. Submarines still carried warheads under the sea. Yet political authority was shifting between leaders who did not fully trust one another. That tension made secure custody, clear chain of command, and reliable communication absolutely essential. It also created urgency for agreements that would keep control stable and prevent accidents, theft, or miscalculation. The remarkable part is that catastrophe did not occur. Even in a moment of extreme uncertainty, systems of custody held, and new arrangements emerged to keep the most destructive weapons on Earth from becoming loose pieces in a collapsing puzzle. Perestroika tried to repair socialism, but it loosened every bolt. The plan was to modernize a worn system without breaking it. New rules encouraged managers to make decisions, factories to respond to demand, and workplaces to experiment with incentives. Once that door opened, old habits started colliding with new expectations. A director could be told to innovate, yet still be punished for missing a target set by someone far away. Enterprises gained room to move, but supply networks and pricing rules stayed tangled. The result felt like changing an engine while driving at full speed. Some people saw possibility, others saw chaos, and both were right in different moments. Reforms also invited a dangerous question that had been kept quiet for decades. If the system needed rebuilding, then maybe it was not inevitable. The attempt to save the structure revealed how many parts were held together by fear and routine. not by trust. Glasnost opened the press, and forbidden history rushed into daylight. For years, many stories lived in whispers, private diaries, and coded jokes. Then newspapers, magazines, and television began to speak more freely, and the country heard itself in a new way. Reports appeared about corruption, disasters, and mistakes that had once been smothered by official silence. Families started comparing what they were reading with what grandparents had hinted at long ago. Writers published works that had been banned, and audiences lined up not for entertainment, but for recognition. Public meetings grew sharper because people finally had language for their anger and grief. This openness did not only change politics, it changed the feeling of reality. When citizens discover that yesterday's forbidden truth is today's headline, they start wondering what else has been hidden. The state had relied on controlling the story of the past. When that story cracked, authority cracked with it. The Soviet economy spent itself on defense and little on consumer life. A superpower built to compete with another superpower makes choices that ordinary shoppers can feel. Enormous talent and resources flowed into rockets, tanks, and secret research cities because security and prestige were treated as survival. The country could astonish the world with engineering, yet struggled to deliver everyday comfort at scale. Engineers trained for advanced projects often had little reason to improve household goods because success was measured by strategic output, not by customer satisfaction. Entire towns revolved around restricted factories where workers had high status, yet the products were never meant for store windows. Over time, this imbalance shaped expectations. Many citizens grew proud of national strength, yet privately tired of a life where simple conveniences felt distant. When reformers asked people to endure more sacrifice for a brighter tomorrow, the promise sounded thinner. A state can win global contests and still lose the patience of its own kitchens. Oil prices fell in the 1980s, and hard currency grew scarce. For a country that exported oil and gas, global prices were not an abstract chart. They were a lifeline. When prices dropped, the government had fewer dollars to buy grain, machines, and technology from abroad. That mattered because parts of the economy depended on imports to keep production moving and to keep cities fed. Leaders faced a cruel choice. They could cut purchases and accept shortages of critical inputs, or they could borrow and deepen financial strain. Either way, the margin for error narrowed. At the same time, citizens were learning to expect more openness and more honesty. Economic pressure does something powerful in a political crisis. It turns patience into calculation. People notice whether promises are backed by resources and whether leaders can deliver anything concrete. The oil shock also weakened Moscow's ability to support allies and maintain influence beyond its borders. A shift in world markets helped expose how fragile the system's budget really was. The Afghanistan war drained lives, money, and confidence for a decade. The conflict began as an intervention meant to stabilize a neighbor, yet it became a long war with no easy victory. Young conscripts were sent to unfamiliar mountains and deserts, facing ambushes, mines, and an enemy that could disappear into the landscape. Coffins returned to towns that were told they were living in a proud, advancing society. Families received vague explanations, and sometimes none at all. Inside the military, morale suffered as the mission expanded and the cost climbed. Equipment wore down. Supplies vanished through corruption. Stories from soldiers contradicted official statements, and those contradictions spread. The war also created a moral wound because it forced citizens to ask what the Soviet Union was doing far from home and why so many were dying for such unclear results. When the withdrawal finally came, it felt less like a conclusion and more like an admission. A state that could not explain its war struggled to explain its future. Returning veterans carried trauma, and the war's purpose felt unclear. When soldiers came home, many discovered that the hardest part was no longer the battlefield. Some returned to silence from officials, awkward praise, or suspicion, because the war was unpopular and poorly understood. Men who had learned to survive by hypervigilance struggled with sleep, temper, and sudden fear in ordinary streets. Friendships fractured. Families felt like strangers. In some places, veterans formed tight circles because only another veteran seemed to understand what had happened. Their experiences also became political, even when they did not intend it. A veteran who speaks openly about chaos, incompetence, or pointless loss can puncture propaganda more effectively than any pamphlet. Communities began to hear stories that did not match the heroic narrative, and that mismatch fueled bitterness. The Soviet system had promised meaning and direction. Veterans embodied the opposite: sacrifice without clarity. As more people listened, the war stopped being distant. It became personal evidence that leaders could demand everything and still fail. The KGB watched everyone, yet it could not stop ideas spreading. A security service can collect files, plant informants, and intimidate dissidents, but it still struggles against a simple fact. People talk. They talk at kitchens, on stairwells, on long train rides, and in coded sentences that outsiders miss. The KGB built a reputation that made citizens cautious, yet that same fear created a strange kind of unity. If you trusted someone enough to speak honestly, the bond felt powerful. Surveillance also produced absurdity. Artists and scientists learned to write with double meanings. Friends developed rituals for checking who might be listening. Rumors moved faster than official statements because rumor felt more believable than propaganda. When reforms loosened censorship, the security apparatus faced a new landscape. It could no longer rely on total control, and it could not arrest an entire country for thinking out loud. Information does not need permission to travel. Once people sensed that the wall of silence had holes, they pushed their voices through them. Underground samizdat writing moved hand to hand, faster than censors. Imagine a book that cannot be sold, cannot be advertised, and cannot be safely discussed in public, yet still finds its readers. That was samizdat. People typed banned essays, poems, and testimonies on carbon paper, then passed the copies along like contraband treasure. Each reader became a distributor, deciding who could be trusted with the next handoff. Pages were recopied until the text grew faint, and mistakes multiplied like fingerprints, which made every copy feel alive. Some works revealed political crimes. Others simply offered honest literature that the state feared. The risk was real. Possession could lead to interrogation, job loss, or worse. Yet the impulse was stronger than caution, because the material answered a hunger for truth and for beauty. Samizdat also trained a generation in civic courage. It taught people to organize quietly, to verify sources, and to build networks outside state institutions. A government can ban a text, but it cannot unwrite it from memory once it has been read. A widening gap grew between official slogans and daily survival. In public, the language of the state promised progress, unity, and historical certainty. In private, many citizens learned to translate those promises into something else. Another delay, another excuse, another grand announcement with no visible change. This gap created a culture of sharp humor and quiet disbelief. Political jokes became a way to say the unsayable and to recognize the same frustration in others. In workplaces, people learned to perform loyalty while quietly bending rules to get things done. You could applaud a speech at noon, then spend the afternoon using personal connections to solve a basic problem. Over time, The split between words and life became exhausting. When leaders asked for renewed faith, citizens measured them against experience, not against ideology. The most dangerous moment for any system is when people stop arguing with it. They simply stop believing it. Once disbelief becomes normal, even a small shock can cause a large collapse, because the foundation is already hollow. Factories met quotas on paper, while quality quietly collapsed. In the quota world, a factory's success could depend on numbers, not usefulness. A plant might be rewarded for producing a certain tonnage, even if the output was awkward, fragile, or poorly finished. Managers learned to game the targets because their careers depended on fulfilling the plan. If the quota measured weight, you made products heavier. If it measured quantity, you made more units, even if they failed quickly. Workers were not always lazy or careless. Many were skilled and proud. The system simply taught them that meeting the plan mattered more than delighting a customer who had no real choice anyway. Over years, this logic corroded trust. Citizens began expecting breakdowns, replacements, and repairs as normal parts of ownership. Repair culture became a survival skill, not a hobby. When market ideas began entering public discussion, people immediately understood the appeal. They were not dreaming of luxury. They were dreaming of reliability. A system that can produce a lot, yet cannot produce well, eventually loses its own credibility. The planned economy hid shortages until openness made them undeniable. In the old system, scarcity could be disguised with paperwork and closed doors. A shop might look stocked on a report while its shelves sat bare, because the plan measured deliveries more than availability. Ministries could shift numbers between categories and declare success while people carried empty bags home. Once public discussion widened, that fog lifted. Journalists described what citizens already knew. Economists spoke about bottlenecks and misaligned incentives. Deputies demanded answers on live broadcasts. The change was not only informational, it was emotional. When a shortage is private, you blame yourself for failing to find what you need. When it becomes public, you start asking who designed the rules. Openness also made comparisons unavoidable. People could see how other countries supplied stores, and they began to wonder why a superpower could not manage soap and sausage. The planned economy had depended on silence as a kind of insulation. When silence broke, the system's weaknesses became common knowledge. Cooperatives were allowed again, and private enterprise returned cautiously. After decades of suspicion toward private trade, a new category appeared that felt almost revolutionary: cooperatives. Cafes, repair shops, small manufacturers, and service businesses began operating with more flexibility than state firms. For many citizens, it was their first taste of choosing a product, choosing a supplier, and being served with something like urgency. The excitement had an edge to it, because the rules were shifting, and nobody knew how long the permission would last. Some cooperatives thrived by filling gaps that the state ignored, like quick meals, tailoring, or home repairs. Others became magnets for resentment, because prices could be higher than state shops, and profits looked indecent to people raised on equality talk. Officials were often suspicious, and inspections could feel like harassment. Yet the idea kept spreading, because it answered needs that ideology had not solved. It also changed how people imagined work. Instead of waiting for the plan, some began building livelihoods with initiative, risk, and a new kind of pride. That shift in imagination was hard to reverse. Prices stayed controlled, and black markets filled the real demand. When official prices are kept low, demand rises, and supply struggles to keep up. That gap becomes a playground for unofficial trade. In late Soviet life, black markets were not just criminals in alleys. They were networks of favors, side deals, and whispered connections. A mechanic might trade spare parts for shoes. A store clerk might hold back goods for someone with the right contact. People learned which train routes carried scarce items, and which market stalls might have imported cigarettes or jeans. The strange part is that many citizens saw this not as moral failure, but as common sense under impossible rules. If the official system could not provide, then you found another way. This shadow economy also taught a dangerous lesson. Rules could be bent, and the state often looked powerless to stop it. When laws lose credibility, society does not become lawless overnight. It becomes negotiated, personal, and unstable. Black markets kept households functioning, yet they also proved that the official economy no longer matched reality. The ruble was not freely convertible, so value became a guessing game. Money is supposed to be a shared agreement about worth. In the late Soviet era, the ruble struggled to play that role beyond the country's borders. Because it could not be freely exchanged like major currencies, value became layered and confusing. There was the official exchange rate, which often felt disconnected from lived experience. There was the street rate, where foreign cash held a mysterious power. There were special shops where hard currency bought goods that ordinary rubles could not, which created a visible hierarchy of purchasing power. A sailor returning from abroad might be treated like a magician for carrying jeans or electronics. A tourist's wallet could seem like a portal to another universe of abundance. This distorted incentives in everyday life. People began to chase dollars, marks, or anything that stored value more reliably than a paycheck. When trust in money weakens, it changes how people think about the future. Savings feel fragile. Plans feel risky. The ruble's limits were not only economic, they were psychological. They quietly told citizens that their own currency was not fully believed in, even by the system that printed it. Soviet farmers grew food, yet the state struggled to deliver it. Across vast fields, people worked hard to raise grain, potatoes, and livestock, yet city shoppers still faced empty counters. The puzzle was not always production. It was the journey from farm to table. Storage could be inadequate, transport unreliable, and incentives badly aligned. If a collective farm exceeded its target, it might not be rewarded in a way that encouraged further effort. If a truck broke down or paperwork stalled a shipment, the loss could vanish into bureaucracy with nobody personally responsible. In some regions, produce spoiled before it reached consumers, even while citizens waited in lines. This disconnect bred cynicism. People could see farmland outside the city, yet still feel that food was a rumor rather than a guarantee. It also encouraged informal solutions. Families used dachas and small garden plots to secure their own supply, and those private gardens became surprisingly important to household survival. The state had tried to manage food through central commands, but food is stubbornly physical. It needs timely harvests, careful handling, and real accountability. When delivery failed, faith failed alongside it. Alcohol reform cut vodka sales, and the budget lost vital revenue. When leaders launched a campaign to curb alcohol abuse, many citizens agreed with the goal. Drinking had harmed health, families, and workplace safety. Yet the policy collided with a hard financial reality. Vodka sales were a major source of state revenue, and reducing them meant a sudden hole in the budget. To enforce the campaign, officials limited supply, raised barriers, and tried to shift social habits. The response was complicated. Some people drank less. Others turned to home distillation and illegal spirits, which could be dangerous and harder to control. The policy also fueled frustration because it felt like another command imposed from above, and it touched daily routines in a deeply personal way. Meanwhile, the state had fewer funds for everything from social programs to imports, right at the moment when the economy was under pressure. It became a lesson in unintended consequences. A moral reform can be admirable, yet still destabilize the system carrying it out. The campaign revealed how dependent the state had become on habits it publicly condemned. Corruption thrived in scarcity because access mattered more than money. In a world of shortages, the most valuable currency is not always cash. It can be a phone call, a cousin in the warehouse, or a friend behind the counter. When goods are limited, access becomes power, and power invites corruption. People learned the art of obtaining necessities through connections, gifts, and quiet deals. Officials who controlled housing lists, permits, or distribution channels could trade favors for loyalty. The practice had its own logic. If you could not buy what you needed openly, then you negotiated privately. Over time, this shaped society's moral weather. People who hated corruption still participated, because refusing could mean your child went without boots or medicine. That constant bargaining eroded trust in institutions. It also fueled anger toward the elite, because citizens suspected that insiders lived in a different reality of special stores and protected privileges. When reformers promised fairness, the public asked for more than speeches. They wanted a system where access was not a secret handshake. Scarcity made corruption feel inevitable, and inevitability made the state feel illegitimate. The term deficit became a daily word, not an abstract statistic. A deficit sounds technical, like something discussed by economists in distant offices. In the late Soviet years, it became a household word because people felt it in their routines. It meant delayed wages, missing supplies, and the uneasy sense that the state was spending promises it could not redeem. Newspapers began printing discussions of budget gaps, debt, and the cost of maintaining a global military posture. When those conversations entered kitchens, citizens started connecting their personal frustrations to national finances. A missing product was no longer just bad luck. It was part of a larger breakdown. Deficits also changed politics because they narrowed options. Leaders could not easily buy loyalty with subsidies or grand projects when money was tight. Republics questioned why they should send resources to the center, especially if the center seemed to mismanage them. As the vocabulary of finance spread, so did a new kind of accountability. People began asking what things cost, who paid, and who benefited. When citizens start talking about budgets, they are no longer only subjects. They are auditors. That shift made the old style of authority harder to sustain. Strikes spread in the coalfields, and workers challenged the state openly. Coal miners had long been treated as heroes of industry, yet hero status did not guarantee decent conditions. In the late 1980s, miners in several regions began striking, and the impact rippled through the entire economy. Coal-powered factories and heated cities, so work stoppages forced leaders to pay attention. The strikes were striking for another reason too. They were not led by dissident intellectuals in distant capitals. They were led by workers, the very class the system claimed to represent. Miners demanded better pay, safer conditions, and more honest management. They also called out the bureaucrats who collected privileges while production sites struggled. The movement created new forms of organization, including strike committees that acted like independent institutions. When the state negotiated, it was acknowledging that pressure from below could change policy. That was a profound shift. A government built on the image of worker unity was now facing worker opposition in public. The coalfields became an early warning that legitimacy was draining away, not from the margins, but from the core. Wage promises lagged behind inflation, and trust thinned further. When prices rise faster than pay, money becomes a shrinking ice cube in your hand. Late Soviet inflation and emerging pricing stability meant that a raise could arrive, yet still feel like a loss. Families adjusted by saving goods instead of cash, because a stocked pantry seemed safer than a bank book. People rushed to spend wages quickly, and that created more pressure on already strained stores. Meanwhile, leaders kept making assurances about living standards and social guarantees. Each promise was measured against the market stall and the grocery line. When it fell short, disappointment hardened into suspicion. Inflation also made inequality more visible. Those with access to scarce goods, foreign currency, or profitable side work could cope. Those living on fixed incomes, including many pensioners, felt trapped. The result was a widening emotional gap between citizens and the state. Trust is built when institutions protect everyday stability. It erodes when people feel that their labor buys less each month, and nobody can explain when relief will come. Economic stress rarely stays economic. It changes how people interpret every speech, every reform, and every appeal for patience. Nationality policy claimed unity, yet identities stayed fiercely alive. The Soviet Union was built on a promise that many peoples could live as one, with republics, flags, and local languages officially recognized. On paper, it looked like a carefully balanced federation. In daily life, identity never stopped being powerful. Families kept old songs, customs, and faiths. Writers kept regional histories alive, sometimes in cautious language, sometimes in allegory. Even the internal passport system, with its line for nationality, reminded people that the state itself was sorting citizens into categories. When openness widened, those long-stored identities surged into public life with startling speed. New political groups formed around language rights and historical memory. Crowds demanded control over schools, media, and local resources. Moscow had imagined nationality policy as a way to manage difference. Instead, it became a set of ready-made containers for independence movements. The republics already existed. The identities already existed. When authority weakened, they were ready to step forward. In Armenia and Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh ignited violent unrest. A mountainous region became a spark that exposed how fragile the Union's internal peace could be. Nagorno-Karabakh was an autonomous area inside the Azerbaijan Republic, yet many of its residents identified strongly with Armenia. As demands grew to change its status, rallies swelled and emotions hardened into fear. What began as petitions and demonstrations turned into clashes, displacement, and deepening hostility. The conflict showed something terrifying about a loosening empire. When central power retreats, local grievances can expand fast because there is no trusted referee. Neighbors who had lived side by side could suddenly feel like enemies, and rumors could become fuel. Leaders in Moscow tried to impose order, yet every intervention seemed to satisfy no one, and each compromise looked like betrayal to someone else. This unrest also mattered beyond the region. It was a warning that the breakup of the Soviet state was not only a constitutional story, it was also a human story, where borders and identities could collide in painful, lasting ways. Georgia's independence movement grew, and Soviet troops faced angry crowds. In Georgia, the push for self-determination gathered force as people remembered earlier lost sovereignty and resented distant rule. Demonstrations grew not only in size, but in confidence. Participants carried national symbols, demanded political freedom, and spoke about the right to decide their own future. The Soviet leadership faced a dilemma. If it tolerated protests, it risked encouraging other republics. If it cracked down, it could inflame resistance and draw global condemnation. Into that tension stepped troops sent to restore order. When soldiers confront crowds, everything becomes fragile. A shouted slogan can become a panic. A sudden movement can be read as a threat. People who came to stand together could end up running, pushing, and falling. The confrontation also changed how Georgians viewed the Union. It stopped being a distant government and became a physical force in their streets. Each standoff sharpened the question of legitimacy. Who truly had the right to command here? The center or the people living on this land? In Tbilisi, a deadly crackdown turned grief into determination. One night in Tbilisi in April 1989, a protest ended in tragedy. Demonstrators had gathered near the parliament building, and tensions rose as security forces moved in. The dispersal became violent, and people died. Many more were injured. The details were argued over, yet the emotional impact was unmistakable. A state that claimed to represent its peoples had killed citizens in a public square. Mourning followed, and mourning became a political force. Funerals and memorials drew crowds that would not have attended a rally, yet they left with the same question burning. If this is unity, why does it arrive with batons and blood? The crackdown also reshaped the movement's tone. It gave independence advocates martyrs, and it made moderation harder to defend. Grief can make people quiet, but it can also make them unwavering. In Georgia, that night convinced many that compromise with the Union was not safety. It was delay. The path forward began to look like separation, whatever the cost. Lithuania declared independence, and Moscow tried to reverse the vote. In March 1990, Lithuania made a decision that sounded impossible only a few years earlier. Its parliament declared the restoration of independence, presenting the move as a return to statehood rather than a new experiment. The reaction from Moscow was swift and forceful because the center feared a chain reaction across the Union. Pressure came through economic levers, political threats, and efforts to isolate Lithuanian leaders. The struggle became a test of wills. Could a small republic stand firm against a superpower that still controlled much of its energy and trade? For Lithuanians, the declaration was not only about law. It was about memory, language, and dignity. For Soviet authorities, it was about precedent. If one republic could leave, others would follow. The standoff also drew attention from abroad, and international interest raised the stakes. In that moment, independence became a living act, not a future dream. Each day the declaration held was a day that weakened the idea of an unbreakable union. In Vilnius, civilians faced tanks, and the world watched in shock. In January 1991, the struggle over Lithuanian independence turned into a confrontation that horrified viewers far beyond the Baltic. Soviet forces moved to seize key sites in Vilnius, including a television tower and other strategic buildings. Civilians gathered to protect them. They did not come with weapons. They came with bodies, voices, and the belief that visibility could be protection. Tanks and armored vehicles approached anyway. People were killed and many were injured, and the images traveled quickly through international media. The violence did not restore Soviet authority. Instead, it did the opposite. It made Lithuania's cause feel urgent and legitimate to outsiders, and it hardened resolve at home. It also exposed a basic truth about the late Soviet state. Even when it used force, it could not control what that force would mean. A crackdown in a capital city was no longer hidden behind censors. It became a global event. The world watched a superpower pushing against unarmed crowds, and many viewers decided which side history was on. Estonia's singing revolution used music as a weapon without guns. In Estonia, mass gatherings turned song into a form of civic power. At festivals and public meetings, people sang traditional pieces and national hymns, that carried identity through decades of control. The sound mattered because it did two things at once. It created unity in the crowd, and it made repression more difficult to justify. Arresting a singer looks different from arresting an armed rebel. The movement also relied on organization, because thousands of voices do not gather by accident. Local activists coordinated events, shared messages, and kept the mood steady when fear could have scattered people. Singing became a way to occupy public space without violence, and to declare that culture itself was a form of sovereignty. It also reminded participants that they were not alone. When you hear a stadium singing the same words, you feel history moving through you. Estonia's path showed that political change does not always begin with weapons or barricades. Sometimes it begins with a chorus that refuses to be silenced. Latvia pushed for sovereignty, and local institutions stopped obeying Moscow. Latvia's drive toward self-rule was not only a matter of crowds and flags. It became a practical struggle over who controlled daily governance. As local leaders asserted greater sovereignty, they began redirecting authority toward Latvian institutions and away from union ministries. That shift could appear bureaucratic, yet it carried revolutionary weight. When local officials stop waiting for Moscow's permission, the center's power becomes theoretical. Decisions about language policy, economic management, and public administration started reflecting Latvian priorities. This also changed loyalties inside the system. Civil servants, police, and managers had to decide whose orders mattered most, and those choices shaped the future without a single dramatic announcement. The push was strengthened by civic groups that mobilized public support and kept pressure on elected bodies. It was also challenged by fears about minority rights and economic disruption, which made the process tense and politically charged. Latvia's story shows how empires end in real life. They end when the paperwork, the institutions, and the habits of obedience quietly relocate to a new center. Ukraine's RUC movement surged, and the giant republic began to drift. When Ukraine began to move, the whole Union felt it, because Ukraine was vast in population, industry, and cultural weight. The People's Movement of Ukraine, known as RUC, rose as a broad civic force that pushed for political reform, language rights, and greater autonomy. It drew in intellectuals, workers, students, and local leaders, and it helped turn private dissatisfaction into public action. The movement mattered because it offered structure. It organized rallies, shaped messaging, and built networks across regions that had often been politically fragmented. It also gave Ukrainians a way to imagine sovereignty as something practical, not just symbolic. As RUC gained momentum, the idea of an indissoluble union began to look unrealistic. If a republic of that size questioned Moscow's authority, then the center could no longer claim that separatism was only a fringe problem. Ukraine's drift was a slow widening of distance, measured in elections, declarations, and shifting public confidence. Each step made the next easier, because it made independence feel familiar rather than unthinkable. A referendum later backed Ukrainian independence by an overwhelming margin. In December 1991, Ukraine held a referendum that turned debate into a clear public verdict. Voters were asked whether the country should be independent, and the result delivered a mandate that few could dismiss. What made it especially powerful was its breadth. Support came not only from one region or one political camp, but from across much of the country, which gave the outcome legitimacy at home and credibility abroad. In the context of the collapsing Union, this vote carried enormous consequences. If Ukraine chose independence, the Soviet Union could not realistically survive as a meaningful federation. Too much of its population, economy, and strategic position would be outside the center's reach. The referendum also changed the tone of diplomacy. Other governments could now treat Ukrainian statehood as the expressed will of its citizens, not merely the ambition of leaders. In the final days of the Union, this democratic act became a pivot point. It turned uncertainty into direction. It also made the world's map change with the weight of ballots, not bullets. Moldova debated language and identity, and tensions rose along the Dniester. As the Soviet center weakened, Moldova found itself pulled between competing visions of belonging. One side pushed to elevate the Moldovan language in public life and to reclaim cultural space that had felt suppressed. Another worried about what those changes would mean for minorities and for ties to the wider Soviet world. The argument was not only about grammar and street signs. It was about who the state was for and who would feel safe inside it. Along the Dniester River, this uncertainty hardened into confrontation. Local leaders in the east resisted policies they feared would marginalize them, and they began building their own institutions and armed groups. Factories, bridges, and police stations became political symbols. The closer independence seemed, the more urgent the standoff became. Moldova's story shows how quickly a debate about identity can turn into a struggle over territory, authority, and everyday security. In Central Asia, riots exposed deep economic and ethnic strain. Central Asia had long been presented as a stable mosaic inside the Union, yet late Soviet pressures made old tensions flare. Housing shortages, unemployment, and perceived favoritism became tinder in crowded cities and fast-growing towns. When rumors spread, they could move faster than officials could respond, especially in a new era where fear of speaking out was fading. Violence in places like the Fergana Valley revealed how quickly neighbors could be pushed apart when resources felt scarce and politics felt uncertain. Markets and bus stops that once meant daily routine suddenly became flashpoints. Authorities tried to restore order with police and troops, yet force could not address the underlying grievances that people were shouting about. These riots also shook Moscow's self-image. The Union was supposed to have solved national questions through brotherhood and planning. The unrest suggested something else. It suggested that unity had often depended on tight control, and that loosening the grip could reveal painful fractures underneath. In Kazakhstan, unrest of the leadership signaled resentment toward Moscow's choices. In December 1986, protests erupted in Alma-Ata after Moscow replaced Kazakhstan's party leader with an outsider who had little local connection. To many Kazakhs, it felt like a blunt reminder that key decisions were still made elsewhere, with local voices treated as optional. Students and young workers flooded the streets, demanding respect and representation. The state responded with a harsh crackdown, arrests and punishment, but could follow participants for years through education and employment. What made the event so significant is how early it was, and how clearly it foreshadowed later revolts. This was not a dispute over a single appointment. It was a challenge to the idea that the center could manage republics like pieces on a board. The unrest became a memory that lingered under the surface. When the Union began to wobble, many people remembered that winter and recognized a pattern. The desire for dignity had been there all along. The Soviet census categories mattered because borders were drawn through lives. A census sounds neutral, like counting heads and recording ages, yet in the Soviet Union, it also helped shape politics. Categories for nationality, language, and residency fed into how republics understood themselves and how leaders argued for power. When the Union began to break, those classifications suddenly mattered in a new way. They influenced claims about who belonged where, which groups were majorities, and which communities might need protection. The numbers were never only numbers. They were linked to schools, media, hiring, and local administration. In some places, A census label could affect a person's opportunities, and it could shape how they were viewed by neighbors. As independence movements grew, activists and officials often reached for demographic data to support competing narratives. The same town could be described as historically one thing and statistically another. When borders harden, people can find themselves counted on one side while their identity feels rooted in another. The census became part of the machinery that turned cultural difference into political stakes. Some republic leaders saw reform as a bridge to full independence. Not every leader in the republics began as a declared separatist. Many started as insiders who understood the system's weaknesses and saw reform as a path to greater control at home. They could champion economic autonomy, environmental protection, or language rights, while presenting themselves as loyal modernizers. Step by step, those reforms created something like a rehearsal for statehood. Local parliaments learned to legislate. Ministries learned to manage budgets. Media outlets learned to speak with a regional voice. Each success made the idea of independence feel less like a leap and more like a logical next stage. Some leaders also learned to ride public sentiment, shifting their rhetoric as crowds grew bolder. When Moscow tried to negotiate, these politicians could point to concrete achievements and say, "We already govern ourselves in practice." By the time the Union's crisis deepened, reform had done more than improve the system. It had built alternative centers of legitimacy. Independence then became not only a dream, but a plan with institutions already taking shape. Others demanded a new Union treaty, hoping to keep resources shared. While some republics leaned toward departure, others feared what a full breakup would bring. They worried about supply chains, energy access, and the practical challenges of building new states from scratch. For them, a new Union treaty looked like a safer route. The idea was to replace rigid central control with a looser federation where republics would be sovereign in many areas, yet still cooperate on currency, defense, and trade. It was an attempt to redesign the house without tearing it down. Negotiations became intense because every clause carried huge consequences. Who would control natural resources? Who would collect taxes? Who would command armed forces? Leaders arrived with different red lines, and they faced publics that were increasingly impatient. The treaty talks also exposed a strange paradox. The more Moscow offered to keep the Union together, the more it admitted it could no longer rule as before. Concessions meant weakness, and weakness encouraged further demands. Even those who wanted a shared framework struggled to agree on what it should be. The center offered compromise, yet every concession encouraged new demands. In the final years, Moscow often tried to calm crises with partial reforms and negotiated deals. A republic might be granted more control over its economy, or a disputed policy might be softened to avoid confrontation. On the surface, compromise sounds like stability. In a collapsing system, it can have the opposite effect. Each concession proved that pressure worked, and it taught activists that the center could be moved. It also unsettled those who relied on clear hierarchy, because rules began changing faster than anyone could memorize them. Hardliners felt betrayed. Reformers felt the changes were too slow. Republic leaders learned to bargain aggressively because they sensed Moscow needed agreement more than they did. The center also faced a credibility trap. If it promised autonomy and then tried to claw it back, it sparked anger. If it followed through, it reduced its own authority. This cycle created a constant rhythm of escalation. Demand, refusal, protest, concession, and then a larger demand. Compromise became less a solution and more a signal that the old command system was running out of force. Old Soviet symbols fell from buildings, and new flags rose quickly. Symbols might seem cosmetic, Yet in political upheaval, they can move faster than laws. Across the republics, people began removing emblems that had represented Soviet power for generations. The hammer and sickle came down from facades. New national flags appeared in squares, on balconies, and behind podiums where leaders spoke to crowds. These changes mattered because they made the shift visible in daily life. A passerby did not need a newspaper to sense that authority was changing. It was hanging above city halls. The battles over symbols could also be tense. Some residents felt pride and relief. Others felt loss or fear of what might replace the old order. In some places, officials tried to control the timing, while activists pushed the moment forward with mass pressure. A flag raising can look simple, yet it carries a claim. This building answers to a different story now. Once symbols change, it becomes harder for the previous regime to pretend nothing has happened. The visual world starts telling the truth. History textbooks changed, and memory became a political battlefield. When a state is breaking apart, control of the past becomes a struggle over the future. Schools began revising textbooks, and suddenly students were hearing names, events, and tragedies that had been minimized or erased. Republic histories moved from footnotes to center stage. Teachers had to navigate shifting guidance, and parents argued over what children should be taught. Memory became political because it shaped legitimacy. If a republic could frame itself as long oppressed, then independence looked like justice. If Soviet history was described as shared achievement, then separation could look like betrayal. Archives opened in uneven ways, and each new document could be used as a weapon in debate. Even the choice of dates for public holidays carried meaning, because it announced which moments deserved honor and which deserved mourning. This battle over memory was not academic. It affected language policy, citizenship rules, and the tone of public life. When people revise the story of who they have been, they also revise the story of who they are allowed to become. Monuments to Lenin stayed standing, while Leninism lost its grip. In many cities, statues of Lenin remained in place even as the ideology tied to his name was fading. That contrast captured the strange speed of the collapse. Stone and bronze can outlast belief. A monument is heavy, and removing it can be politically risky, logistically difficult, and emotionally divisive. Some communities saw Lenin as a symbol of oppression. Others saw him as part of their personal history, tied to childhood, education, or wartime memory. Meanwhile, the ideas that had once felt unquestionable were being challenged in parliaments, on television, and in crowded streets. People were learning to speak in a political language that did not rely on party doctrine. The statue might still point toward the horizon, yet fewer people believed the promised destination was real. This mismatch created moments that felt almost surreal. A new flag could fly over a square while Lenin watched from the pedestal below. The old iconography became a backdrop for a new era, and the contradiction told its end story. The system had not only fallen, it had been mentally vacated. The Warsaw Pact began to crumble, and allies stopped taking orders. For decades, the Warsaw Pact was presented as a solid military bloc, a disciplined counterweight to NATO. In the late 1980s, that discipline started slipping in public view. Governments in Eastern Europe began acting like national capitals again, not like outposts awaiting instruction. Defense plans that once assumed automatic alignment became awkward conversations. Officers wondered whether joint exercises still meant unity or simply habit. As political change spread, the pact's real foundation was tested. It was never only treaties and tanks. It was the assumption that Moscow would enforce obedience. When that assumption weakened, Allied leaders found space to say no, or to say nothing at all. The pact still existed on paper, yet it was losing its inner certainty. The crumbling mattered because it changed the Soviet Union's sense of security. The empire was not only shrinking politically, it was losing the shield of guaranteed loyalty just beyond its western border. Poland's solidarity won, and it showed Moscow could be defied. In Poland, an independent trade union movement did more than demand better conditions. It became a national challenge to one-party rule. After years of pressure, negotiations, and crackdowns that failed to end the idea, solidarity reached a moment where ballots mattered. When opposition candidates swept key seats in partly free elections, it proved something that had seemed impossible in the Soviet orbit. A communist government could lose legitimacy in broad daylight and survive the loss without Soviet tanks restoring the old order. That lesson traveled fast. Activists elsewhere saw that persistence could outlast intimidation. Party officials elsewhere saw that Moscow might not come to the rescue. The psychological shift was enormous. Fear had been a tool of governance. Poland showed fear could be managed and even overcome through organization and public support. For the Soviet leadership, the Polish outcome created a new reality. Control was no longer automatic. It had to be negotiated, and negotiation invited more demands. Hungary opened its border, and East Germans found an escape route. In the summer of 1989, Hungary made a decision that changed Europe's map of possibility. It began dismantling barriers on its border with Austria, and the seam in the Iron Curtain started to loosen. East Germans who could travel to Hungary suddenly had a path toward the west. Many camped in parks and churches, waiting for a chance to cross. Some slipped through quietly. Others moved in groups, driven by equal parts hope and exhaustion. The East German government tried to contain the crisis, yet every departure was a public embarrassment, a vote of defeat against the system. Hungary's opening created a chain reaction. It pressured diplomatic negotiations, it intensified protests back in East Germany, and it made the Berlin Wall look less like a permanent structure and more like a failing dam. The border change was also a reminder that empires can be undone by administrative choices. A gate that opens can matter as much as an army that retreats. Czechoslovakia's Velvet Revolution toppled a regime without a civil war. In Czechoslovakia, the fall of the communist government became a lesson in momentum without mass violence. Demonstrations grew in Prague and other cities, and crowds returned again and again, even when police tried to intimidate them. The movement drew strength from students, theatre people, workers, and dissidents who had waited years for a break in the weather. What made it velvet was not softness of purpose. It was the refusal to turn streets into battlefields. Leaders of the old regime discovered that orders were less effective when the public no longer accepted their authority. When negotiations began, the system's moral power was already gone. The revolution also elevated voices that had been pushed to the margins, including figures associated with civic courage and cultural life. As the government changed hands, the world saw a dramatic contrast with earlier decades of Soviet-backed repression. The transition showed that a police state can collapse not only from invasion or economic ruin. It can collapse when citizens withdraw consent in a coordinated, visible way. Romania's revolution turned bloody, and the speed startled the Kremlin. Romania offered a darker picture of the same regional upheaval. Protests erupted, repression followed, and the situation escalated into gunfire, chaos, and rapid regime collapse. One of the most shocking elements was how quickly the narrative flipped. A leader who had appeared immovable suddenly faced mass hostility, then capture, then a grim conclusion that unfolded with dizzying speed. The violence exposed how brittle fear-based authority can be when it finally breaks. Once people believe the security forces might not hold, the spell can shatter in hours. For Moscow, Romania's turmoil was alarming for two reasons. It showed that change could turn uncontrollable, and it showed that communist power could end in seams that were messy and internationally visible. The Soviet leadership had hoped for reform that looked orderly. Romania demonstrated that the region's anger was not always negotiable. The bloodshed also deepened the sense that the old system had run out of peaceful ways to correct itself. When a government responds to panic with bullets, it often accelerates the very collapse it fears. Moscow refused to invade again, breaking the fear that once held. For much of the Cold War, Eastern European leaders governed with an unspoken guarantee. If they faced a serious challenge, Soviet force might arrive to restore the line. In the late 1980s, that guarantee faded. Moscow signaled, through words and through inaction, that it would not repeat earlier interventions. This choice was partly practical. The Soviet economy was strained, and international pressure was higher. It was also political, because reform-minded leaders wanted a different kind of legitimacy. Whatever the reason, the effect was historic. The fear that had disciplined entire governments began to drain away. Opposition movements could plan with a new assumption. They might be beaten locally, but they might not face invasion. Party officials could no longer lean on a distant army as their final argument. The refusal to invade did not automatically create democracy, and it did not prevent later turmoil. Yet it changed the basic rules of the region. It told millions that the empire's reach had limits, and limits invite courage. The Brezhnev doctrine faded, and each satellite chose its own path. The Brezhnev doctrine had been a warning dressed as policy. It said that socialism in any allied country was a shared concern, which meant Moscow reserved the right to intervene. When that doctrine lost force, Eastern Europe gained room to improvise. Some countries moved toward negotiated transitions, building coalitions and rewriting laws. Others faced sudden collapses and uneasy compromises. The key change was choice itself. Leaders were no longer compelled to copy a single model of obedience. They could experiment, stall, or accelerate, depending on local pressures and personalities. That variety made the region unpredictable, and unpredictability is dangerous for an empire that depends on uniformity. It also influenced citizens inside the Soviet Union. If Allied states could decide their futures, why not the Union's own republics? The fading doctrine created a mirror. It reflected back to Moscow the possibility that control was not destiny. Once doctrine becomes optional, it stops being doctrine. It becomes history. Eastern Europe's different paths made the Soviet center look less like a guiding force and more like one participant in a rapidly changing continent. German reunification moved ahead, and Soviet troops prepared to leave. When the two German states began moving toward reunification, it forced the Soviet Union into decisions of enormous symbolic weight. Soviet forces had been stationed in East Germany for decades, a physical reminder of victory in the Second World War and of the post-war order. Now negotiations and timelines pushed those forces toward departure. Officers had to plan logistics that looked like a retreat, even if it was framed as cooperation. Families living on bases faced relocation, housing shortages, and uncertain futures back home. The shift also reshaped security calculations. A reunified Germany raised questions about alliances, borders, and the meaning of peace in Europe. For many Soviets, it was emotionally complicated. The war memory was sacred, and the occupation had been tied to sacrifice. Yet the political tide was stronger. Preparing to leave East Germany signaled that Moscow was accepting a new European reality. It was not only losing influence, it was relinquishing a stage where it had once appeared unstoppable. The troop movement became a quiet announcement that the old century was ending. The Soviet military withdrew, and an era of occupation quietly ended. As Soviet units left Eastern Europe, the departure was not a single dramatic moment. It was a long sequence of trains, convoys, inventory lists, and handovers. Barracks emptied. Airfields changed hands. Equipment that had been positioned for a potential war was shipped back to a country in economic trouble. The withdrawal ended an occupation that had shaped politics, culture, and daily life for generations. For local populations, it meant a new kind of breathing room. For Soviet soldiers, it often meant uncertainty. Many returned to poor housing and limited prospects, and some felt forgotten by the state they had served. The scale of the move was vast, and it carried risks of accidents, theft, and disorder. Yet it happened, and that fact itself was remarkable. Empires do not always dismantle themselves by schedule. This one, at least in that chapter, did. The end of occupation also removed a major instrument of Soviet leverage. Without troops on the ground, Moscow's influence had to rely on persuasion, trade, and diplomacy, which were harder tools to master during internal collapse. Eastern Europe's breakaway made the Soviet Union look suddenly alone. When Eastern European states slipped free, the Soviet Union lost more than territory it did not formally own. It lost a sense of inevitability. The empire's outer ring had provided strategic depth, ideological validation, and the appearance of a shared historical mission. As those countries turned away, the Soviet Union stood exposed, and the contrast was painful. Neighbors were reforming, voting, and redefining their futures, while Moscow struggled with shortages, political infighting, and rising nationalist demands at home. Internationally, the Soviet bloc stopped looking like a single force. It began looking like a dissolving arrangement that could not hold its members. This mattered inside the Union too. Citizens could watch Eastern Europeans choose different paths, and they could ask why their own system felt stuck between reform and collapse. The breakaway also weakened the narratives that had justified sacrifice for decades. If allies could leave, then the Soviet story of leadership and historical direction sounded less convincing. Loneliness is not only emotional in geopolitics, it is structural. With fewer dependable partners, Moscow had fewer buffers, fewer bargaining chips, and fewer places to hide its internal fractures. Inside the party, reformers and hardliners fought for the same microphone. What looked like a single ruling machine was becoming a crowded room full of competing agendas. Reformers wanted openness, experimentation, and a looser grip on public life. Hardliners feared that any loosening would trigger collapse, and they were not entirely wrong. Meetings that once existed to confirm decisions became arenas where people argued over the direction of the state itself. A speech could be applauded in the hall, then attacked in the corridor. Alliances formed and broke quickly, based on personal survival as much as principle. Regional bosses watched the struggle and adjusted their loyalties minute by minute. Even the language changed. Words like renewal and discipline became coded signals for opposing camps. The fight mattered because the party had been the glue of the system. When the glue began arguing with itself, citizens could sense the weakness. A government can survive criticism from outside. It struggles when its own commanding voice becomes a chorus of contradictions. Gorbachev tried to balance both sides and pleased almost nobody. He faced a problem that was almost impossible to solve. If he moved too slowly, reformers accused him of protecting a broken order. If he moved too quickly, conservatives accused him of dismantling the state. He tried to stand in the middle, offering change with limits and compromise with authority. In practice, that meant constant recalibration. 1 week brought a new promise of liberalization. Another week brought reassurance to security chiefs and party elders. Each adjustment aimed to keep the country from tearing, yet each one also signaled uncertainty. Reformers wanted a clear break with old habits. Hardliners wanted a clear return to control. The middle path satisfied neither, and it created an impression of hesitation at the top. Meanwhile, events moved faster than careful planning. National movements surged. Economic strain grew. Media scrutiny intensified. The more he tried to hold every side together, the more every side treated him as the obstacle. In the end, the role demanded decisiveness, yet the moment punished every decision. The Congress of People's Deputies brought live debate to Soviet television. For many viewers, it was the first time politics sounded like real disagreement instead of a scripted ceremony. Delegates argued in front of cameras, challenged ministers, and asked questions that had once been unthinkable. The broadcast changed family evenings. People sat at home and listened, not to music or drama, but to lawmakers exposing problems in plain language. A sharp exchange could become tomorrow's conversation at work. A bold speech could make a delegate famous overnight. The Congress also created a new kind of legitimacy. If leaders could be questioned publicly, then authority was no longer purely vertical. It was performative and fragile, and it could be lost with a bad answer. The sessions revealed regional conflicts, economic confusion, and competing visions of the future. They also taught citizens a new habit. Watching power argue is different from being told that power is unanimous. Once people have seen debate, they start expecting it everywhere. Viewers saw leaders argue in public, and the spell broke. The Soviet system had relied on a particular atmosphere. The leadership presented itself as unified, confident, and historically destined. Public conflict was meant to be invisible. When televised arguments became normal, the atmosphere changed. Citizens could hear hesitation, irritation, and fear in the voices of officials who had once seemed untouchable. They could watch someone interrupt a minister, and nothing terrible happened. They could see applause split between rivals. That visibility had a quiet power. It made the state feel human, and being human is not always helpful for a regime built on inevitability. Public quarrels also invited judgment. People began choosing who sounded honest, who sounded evasive, and who sounded exhausted. Trust shifted away from institutions and toward personalities, which is a dangerous transition during a crisis. Even those who disliked politics were affected, because the sound of disagreement reached into homes. The spell was the idea that the system was above ordinary doubt. Once doubt was televised, it became ordinary. Andrei Sakharov returned from exile, and moral authority gained a face. When he was allowed back into public life, it signaled more than a change in one person's fate. It signaled a change in what could be said and who could be respected openly. He was a celebrated scientist, yet he became known to many as a conscience who spoke about rights, repression, and the dignity of individuals. His presence mattered because it challenged the old idea that the state alone defined patriotism. Here was someone who had served national achievement, yet refused to stay silent about harm. When he spoke in public forums, listeners heard a different tone from official rhetoric. It was blunt, principled, and sometimes uncomfortable. That discomfort was the point. In a system trained to punish dissent, the dissident who was not crushed became a symbol of shifting limits. His return also encouraged others to speak, because it suggested that honesty might be survivable. Moral authority is not measured in titles. It is measured in the courage to say what powerful people would rather not hear. Party bosses in the republics became nationalist presidents in disguise. In many republics, the most experienced politicians were still the old party leaders. They knew the bureaucracy, the security networks, and the levers of local power. As the union weakened, some of these figures adjusted with remarkable speed. They began adopting the language of national renewal, endorsing cultural pride, and positioning themselves as defenders of local interests. The shift could look sincere or strategic, or both at once. The important part is that it worked. A man who had once enforced Moscow's line could reinvent himself as the voice of a republic's destiny. This transformation mattered because it gave independence movements administrative muscle. A street movement can raise a flag. A seasoned apparatus can run a state. The rebranded leaders could negotiate with the center, manage local institutions, and claim continuity during uncertainty. It also created tension inside society. Some citizens saw these leaders as opportunists who were escaping responsibility. Others saw them as practical guides through chaos. Either way, the old elite was not simply replaced. In many places, it changed costumes and stayed on stage. Elections created rivals, and rivals created real alternatives. Once contested elections entered public life, politics became something people could shape rather than endure. Candidates had to persuade, not simply be appointed. That meant speeches that sounded less ceremonial and more personal. It meant leaflets, debates, and alliances that formed outside the party's usual pathways. Most importantly, it created rivals with their own bases of support. A rival can say no, and that single word can change a system built on unanimous approval. Rivalry also forced exposure. Officials who wanted votes had to talk about housing, wages, local pollution, and the everyday problems that had once been treated as embarrassing details. Voters began to learn the power of turnout, because a low turnout could signal apathy, and a high turnout could signal rebellion. These elections were not always fair, and they did not always produce effective governance. Yet they created a new expectation. If leaders can be replaced, then leaders must listen. That expectation spread faster than any law. It turned politics into competition, and competition is a solvent for old certainties. The state loosened control of religion, and faith returned publicly. For decades, official ideology had treated religion as something to be managed, discouraged, or pushed into private corners. When restrictions eased, the change was visible almost immediately. Religious communities reopened spaces, rebuilt networks, and began holding services that felt newly legitimate. For many people, this was not a sudden conversion. It was a resurfacing of something that had survived in families and traditions, carried quietly across generations. Public faith also offered emotional structure during uncertainty. When politics felt unstable and the economy felt unreliable, rituals could offer steadiness and meaning. The return of religion changed the public square. Leaders began appearing at ceremonies. Media coverage shifted in tone. Communities that had been fragmented by fear could gather again. This revival also complicated national politics. In some places, faith became linked with language and identity, which strengthened local movements. In other places, it raised questions about pluralism and minority rights. The key point is that the Soviet state had tried to shape citizens from the top down. When faith returned openly, it reminded everyone that loyalties can run deeper than government. Churches and mosques reopened, and communities found older loyalties. A reopened building can become a reopened memory. When churches and mosques began welcoming larger public congregations, people did not only return to prayer. They returned to community structures that had existed before Soviet power and had endured beneath it. Weddings, funerals, and seasonal festivals regained their public language. Elders who had kept traditions alive at home suddenly became guides again. In some towns, rebuilding a shrine or restoring an icon was a shared project that offered purpose when politics felt exhausting. These older loyalties also reshaped social trust. You might not trust a ministry, but you might trust a local religious leader who had lived among you for years. This mattered during the unraveling of state authority, because social stability often depends on institutions people recognize. It also created new lines of debate. Some welcomed revival as moral renewal. Others worried about exclusion or rising pressure to conform. Either way, the reopening was a reminder that the Soviet project had never fully replaced older identities. It had often covered them, and now the cover was lifting. The official future sounded uncertain, and the past sounded clearer. For much of Soviet life, the future was described as a guaranteed destination. Progress had a timetable. History had a direction. In the final years, that certainty faded. Plans changed. Policies reversed. Leaders spoke in cautious terms that did not match the grand confidence of earlier decades. When the future becomes vague, people start looking backward for something solid. Old stories, national histories, family memories, and regional traditions can feel more reliable than shifting slogans. This turn toward the past was not always peaceful. Different groups remembered different wounds and different heroes, and those memories could collide. Yet the impulse was understandable. A person can endure hardship if they believe it leads somewhere. When the destination disappears, hardship feels pointless. The past offered anchors, even if those anchors were heavy. It also offered new political language. Movements could claim legitimacy by invoking earlier independence, earlier injustices, or earlier cultural golden ages. As the official future lost its voice, competing pasts spoke louder, and they pulled people in different directions. The new Union Treaty was planned, and the coup tried to stop it. By the summer of 1991, a new deal was being drafted to keep the country together in a looser form. The idea was to trade the old command structure for a federation where republics would have real sovereignty, yet still share key systems like defense and the economy. For hardliners, that plan sounded like surrender. For many republic leaders, it sounded like the last acceptable compromise. That tension made the scheduled signing feel like a countdown clock. Everyone understood what it meant. If the treaty went through, the old Soviet Union would effectively become something else, and the party's grip would never fully return. The plotters acted because they believed delay was defeat. Their timing was not random. It was an attempt to freeze the future before it arrived. The drama of the coup makes more sense when you picture that treaty waiting on the calendar, like a door that was about to swing open. Hardliners formed the emergency committee, claiming they were saving the country. The coup leaders presented themselves as caretakers, not conquerors. They announced an emergency committee, spoke about restoring order, and insisted the nation was sliding into chaos that only they could prevent. The language was dramatic, yet it was also revealing. They were not offering a new vision. They were trying to revive an older fear-based stability. Their message was aimed at citizens who worried about shortages, crime, and the speed of change. It was aimed at officials who feared losing rank and privileges. It was aimed at soldiers who had been trained to obey. The committee's existence showed how fragmented authority had become. Instead of a single, unquestioned center, there were now competing centers that each claimed legality. The hardliners were betting that the habit of obedience was stronger than the new taste for openness. They also underestimated how much the country had changed. When people have heard real debate and seen real protests, a sudden return to commands can feel like an insult. They seized television, yet could not control the streets. One of the first moves of the coup was about the story. If you can dominate the broadcast, you can dominate perception, at least for a while. State television was taken over, regular programming was disrupted, and stiff announcements tried to project calm authority. Yet outside the studio walls, the city was doing something television could not easily erase. People were gathering, arguing, and moving toward key buildings. Information leaked through phone calls, word of mouth, and independent radio. Even a rumor could beat a scripted bulletin when the public already suspected official media of lying. The group's control of screens created a strange split reality. In living rooms, viewers saw rehearsed certainty. On the streets, citizens saw confusion and a growing refusal to comply. That contrast was deadly for the plotters. A takeover depends on the belief that resistance is futile. Crowds proved that resistance was already happening, and cameras soon captured it anyway. Once images of defiance spread, television stopped being a weapon and became a witness. Soldiers hesitated to fire, and obedience turned into doubt. A coup can survive bad speeches, but it cannot survive a military that will not act. In Moscow, many troops arrived with unclear instructions and an uneasy sense that they were being used against civilians. Some soldiers were young conscripts who did not want to be remembered for shooting their own people. Some officers sensed that the political wind was shifting, and they feared betting on the losing side. As crowds grew, the moment became personal. A soldier could see faces, hear chants, and recognize that these were not foreign enemies. The hesitation was not only moral, it was practical. If orders are disputed, then following them can become a legal and political trap. The group leaders needed a decisive show of force to break resistance quickly. Instead, they got uncertainty, delays, and units that waited instead of striking. In that pause, doubt spread through the ranks like a slow electrical fault. Once a chain of command begins questioning itself, it can collapse faster than a crowd ever could. Yeltsin's defiance split the security apparatus, and the coup withered. The coup expected the security services and key ministries to behave like a single body. Instead, they fractured. A public challenge from the Russian leadership created a clear choice that many officials had hoped to avoid. Support the plotters and risk being condemned if they fail. Resist the plotters and risk immediate retaliation if they succeed. As the standoff continued, more figures made quiet decisions, and those decisions did not all point the same way. Some units protected the Russian parliament building. Some agencies dragged their feet. Some commanders signaled neutrality, which in a coup is almost the same as opposition. This split was fatal because the plotters were relying on speed and unity. They needed the machinery of the state to move as one, with orders flowing cleanly from the top. Instead, the machinery jammed. When an authoritarian system loses coordination, it loses its main advantage. The coup began to look less like a takeover and more like a confused argument inside a crumbling house. With each hour, the plotters appeared weaker, and weakness invites defiance. After the coup failed, the Communist Party was suspended in Russia. When the coup collapsed, it did not simply end an episode. It triggered retaliation against the institutions seen as responsible for the attempted rollback. In Russia, the Communist Party was suspended, and that decision carried immense symbolic weight. For generations, the party had been the spine of the state. Careers, permissions, and public life had run through its channels. Now One Republic, the largest and most central, was moving to cut that spine. The suspension also reshaped who could claim authority. If the party could be halted, then it was no longer the ultimate referee of politics. This opened space for new power centers, new laws, and new narratives about legitimacy. It also sent a signal to other republics. The old tools of union cohesion were weakening fast, and the center could no longer rely on party discipline to hold the system together. The party's sudden fall in Russia was like watching a cornerstone removed while the building was still occupied. People could almost feel the structure shifting. Republics accelerated independence because the center looked powerless. The coup's failure was not reassuring. It was destabilizing. It showed that the Soviet center could be hijacked, and it also showed that the center could not reliably defend itself. For Republic leaders weighing their options, this was a warning. Waiting for a new, stable union might mean waiting forever. The safest path began to look like building sovereignty quickly, while momentum and public support were high. Parliaments moved faster. Declarations came in tighter succession. Institutions started preparing for separate control of borders, finances, and security forces. The logic was blunt. If Moscow could not guarantee order, then Moscow could not demand loyalty. Independence efforts also became contagious. Each successful step in one republic encouraged bolder steps in another, because the fear of isolation began to fade. The center tried to negotiate, but negotiation from a position of weakness often sounds like pleading. After August, the question was no longer whether the Union would change. The question was how many pieces it would become, and how quickly those pieces could stand on their own. Gorbachev resigned as party leader, and his base evaporated. For years, his power had depended on an uneasy balance between state leadership and party authority. When he stepped down as head of the Communist Party, that balance shattered. The resignation did not merely change a title. It removed the network that had traditionally enforced decisions across ministries, factories, and regions. Without that apparatus, presidential authority became thinner and more negotiable. It also exposed a painful irony. The reforms that made him globally famous also weakened the structure that had once supported him. By resigning, he was acknowledging that the party could no longer be the engine of governance, and that admission traveled fast. Rivals inside the Soviet system gained room to move. Republic leaders gained more independence in practice. Even ordinary citizens could sense the drift. If the leader who had opened the system no longer commanded the party, then who did? The resignation was a moment where the center lost another layer of cohesion. After that, he was increasingly a president of a country that was already slipping away from his hands. The Soviet flag still flew, but authority had already moved away. There is a particular kind of historical twilight when the symbols remain, yet the power behind them has relocated. In the final months, you could still see the Soviet flag on buildings and documents, and you could still hear official language that implied a functioning union. Yet the decisions that mattered were being made elsewhere, often in Republican capitals and new executive offices. Ministries struggled to enforce directives. Regional leaders behaved like heads of independent states. Even international partners began dealing directly with emerging powers rather than treating Moscow as the sole voice. This mismatch created an almost surreal atmosphere. The Union looked intact in ceremony, but it felt hollow in operation. People can live for a while inside hollow institutions, and many did, because daily life still required paperwork, salaries, and permits. But hollowness is unstable. It turns every crisis into a question of who is actually in charge. A flag can signal continuity, yet it cannot compel obedience. By the time the flag finally came down, the real transfer of authority had already happened, quietly and unevenly, in the routines of governance. A giant state lost its command system, one ministry at a time. The Soviet Union was built to function through centralized ministries that controlled production, transport, energy, and planning across enormous distances. As the Union weakened, those ministries began losing the ability to command. Not all at once, but piece by piece. A republic might refuse an order. A local official might delay compliance. A factory might prioritize regional needs over union quotas. Each small breakdown forced workarounds, and workarounds reduced the center's leverage even further. Communication lines became muddled because different authorities issued competing instructions. Budgets became contested because revenue was increasingly kept locally. The result was administrative paralysis. Even leaders who wanted to preserve a shared state found that the machinery was no longer responding reliably. This is how large systems often fail. They do not explode. They stall. When ministries cannot coordinate deliveries, payrolls, or supply chains, the political map starts changing in people's minds. The state begins to feel less like a governing presence and more like a fading logo on forms. Losing the command system meant losing the practical ability to be a country. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a forest and rewrote history. In December 1991, leaders from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus gathered in a forest residence in Belarus and made a decision that changed the world. This was not a grand congress in a glittering capital. It was a smaller meeting in a quiet place, which somehow made the outcome feel even more startling. These three republics had been central to the Soviet project from the beginning, and now their leaders were discussing how to end it. The setting gave the moment an almost unreal quality. A state that had shaped wars, alliances, and daily life for generations was being dismantled around a table by men with papers and pens rather than armies. The meeting also showed how far power had shifted from the old center. The future of the Union was no longer being decided only in Kremlin chambers. It was being decided by Republican leaders acting with their own authority and with remarkable speed. The Belavasia Accords declared the Union ended without a nationwide vote. The agreement signed in that Belarusian forest did something breathtakingly direct. It stated that the Soviet Union no longer existed and that a new arrangement would take its place. There was no union-wide referendum on whether the state itself should survive in that final form. There was no long public trial of its legitimacy. A handful of leaders, acting from the authority of their republics, made the declaration and sent it outward into history. That gave the moment a strange mixture of legality and shock. Some people saw it as practical realism, because the old system had already stopped functioning. Others saw it as a breathtaking elite decision imposed on millions. Either way, it marked a historic transfer of power from empire to successor states. The Accords also exposed how exhausted the Union had become. A country that once governed through immense bureaucracy could now be ended by a few signatures, because so much of its real authority had already drained away. The Commonwealth of Independent States replaced the Union, but not its certainty. After the Soviet Union was declared over, a new framework appeared almost immediately. The Commonwealth of Independent States was meant to provide cooperation without restoring full central rule. It offered a way for former republics to coordinate on trade, diplomacy, and practical questions while acknowledging that they were now separate states. On paper, that sounded tidy. In reality, it was full of ambiguity. Was this a gentle landing for the old system, or merely a waiting room before full separation? Could member states truly cooperate while each was busy inventing its own institutions, borders, and priorities? The Commonwealth reflected a real need because railways, pipelines, families, and military structures had not vanished overnight. Yet it also reflected uncertainty because nobody knew how much of the shared Soviet world could be preserved without reviving the Union itself. It was a bridge built while the river was still flooding. The structure existed, but certainty did not travel across it. On Christmas Day, Gorbachev resigned, and the Kremlin lights dimmed. On December the 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev addressed the public and resigned as President of the Soviet Union. The timing gave the moment an almost theatrical stillness, because much of the world was already in holiday mode while one of the century's great powers reached its formal end. His speech carried the weight of personal defeat and historical transition at once. He spoke as a man who had tried to transform the system, only to preside over its disappearance. Afterward, the symbolism became unforgettable. The Kremlin, long associated with Soviet authority, seemed to lose something more than a leader. It lost the state that had given its recent meaning. For many watching, the moment felt subdued rather than explosive. There was no final battle. There was a resignation, a transfer, and a sense that an era had slipped away through official language and ceremony. Sometimes history ends not with thunder, but with a tired voice acknowledging that the structure no longer stands. The red flag came down, and the Russian tricolour rose in its place. One of the most powerful images of the collapse came from the sky above the Kremlin. The red Soviet flag, which had flown over the center of power for decades, was lowered, and the Russian tricolour rose to replace it. In pure visual terms, it was simple. In historical terms, it was immense. A symbol that had represented revolution, superpower rivalry, and a vast multinational state gave way to the banner of one successor country. The change did not merely mark the end of an administration. It marked the end of a political world. For people watching at home and abroad, the image compressed decades of history into a few minutes of motion. It also clarified something that speeches could blur. Russia was not simply carrying the Soviet Union forward unchanged. It was inheriting part of its power while also stepping into a different identity. The flags made that distinction visible. One order descended. Another rose, uncertain, familiar, and entirely new at once. The Soviet seat at the United Nations shifted to Russia overnight. The collapse did not only reshape maps. It also reshaped who spoke for a vanished superpower in the institutions of the world. One of the most consequential transitions happened at the United Nations, where Russia assumed the Soviet Union's seat, including its permanent place on the Security Council. That continuity was astonishing in its own way. A state disappeared, yet one republic inherited its diplomatic position without creating a prolonged global crisis over representation. For Russia, this was a major prize because it preserved prestige and influence at the highest international level. For the wider world, it offered a practical solution during a moment of extraordinary instability. Yet the seamlessness of the transition also concealed deep tension. Which parts of Soviet power belonged to Russia, and which belonged to the former Union collectively? The seat suggested one answer in diplomacy, even while other questions remained unsettled elsewhere. It was a reminder that empires can dissolve unevenly. Some assets scatter. Others are seized by the largest successor before the dust has even settled. The army, the treasury, and the archives were divided in tense negotiations. Ending a giant state is not only about flags and speeches. It is also about paperwork, warehouses, vaults, and locked rooms full of records. Once the Union collapsed, former republics had to confront an enormous practical question. Who gets what? The army had personnel, weapons, bases, and chains of command spread across new borders. The treasury held reserves, debts, and obligations no one could ignore. The archives contained the documentary memory of the state, including secrets, crimes, and claims of ownership. These were not details at the edge of history. They were central to whether the new states could function and whether old truths might come to light. Negotiations were tense because every item carried both material and symbolic value. A file could shape a reputation. A base could shape security. A debt could shape the future of an entire budget. The breakup of the Soviet Union happened on television, But it was also fought out in offices where the real machinery of inheritance was being counted and contested. Nuclear weapons were spread across republics, then pulled back by treaties. When the Soviet Union disappeared, some of its nuclear weapons remained on the territory of multiple newly independent republics. This created one of the most extraordinary security situations of the modern age. The weapons had been built under a single command structure, yet now they stood inside states that were suddenly sovereign. The danger was not only military, it was political and logistical. Control had to be clear, custody had to remain secure, and the world needed confidence that these arsenals would not become bargaining chips in a chaotic breakup. What followed was a complicated effort of diplomacy, pressure, and agreement that led to the weapons being transferred and dismantled under treaty frameworks. The remarkable part is not only that this happened, but that it happened amid economic collapse and institutional confusion. A superpower's most terrifying inheritance was managed through negotiation at a moment when almost everything else felt uncertain. The process became one of the quiet achievements of the post-Soviet transition, because disaster was imaginable, and yet it was avoided. Control of the Black Sea Fleet became a bitter post-imperial dispute. Some arguments after an empire falls are really arguments about memory, pride, and geography all at once. The Black Sea Fleet was one of them. Ships, bases, and command structures tied to Soviet power suddenly sat inside a new political landscape, where Russia and Ukraine both had urgent claims and deep emotions. The fleet was not just a military asset. It carried the weight of prestige, regional security, and historical identity, especially in Crimea and the port of Sevastopol. Negotiations grew tense because neither side wanted to appear weak on such a visible issue. Officers faced uncertain loyalties. Sailors had to think about which state they served. Politicians understood that naval arrangements could shape wider relations for years to come. The dispute showed how hard it is to divide something built for a single empire when that empire no longer exists. A fleet cannot be neatly cut in half like a ledger. It carries tradition, territory, and strategic anxiety wherever it anchors. New borders appeared, and families found themselves in different countries. One of the strangest human consequences of the Soviet collapse was how often geography stayed the same while nationality changed overnight. A border that had once been an internal administrative line could suddenly become an international frontier with customs rules, visas, and political meaning. Families who had moved freely for work, marriage, or study found themselves living in different countries without ever having imagined such a future. A grandmother might remain in one republic, while her children and grandchildren were now citizens of another. Holiday visits could turn into paperwork. Language that felt ordinary in one era could become politically sensitive in the next. These changes made the breakup intimate. It was not only a matter of presidents and parliaments. It entered kitchens, train stations, and family photo albums. Many people had to reconsider who they were in legal terms and emotional terms at the same time. Borders drawn through maps are one thing. Borders drawn through family life are something far more unsettling because they transform the familiar into the newly foreign. Soviet passports became relics, while new citizenship rules arrived unevenly. The passport is supposed to answer a simple question. Who are you in the eyes of the state? After the Soviet collapse, that answer became unexpectedly slippery. Millions of people still held Soviet passports, even as the country that issued them had vanished. New states had to create laws for citizenship, residency, and belonging, and they did not all move at the same speed. Some people qualified easily. Others found themselves trapped in legal gray zones, especially in places where language, ethnicity, or migration history had become politically sensitive. A document that once opened the same internal world now felt like a fading artifact from a country that no longer existed. The uncertainty could be deeply personal. Your birth city mattered. Your parents' background mattered. The year you moved might matter. Citizenship rules became a way of deciding who counted as fully part of the new nation. That made paperwork feel like destiny. In the ruins of an empire, identity was no longer only a matter of memory. It was also a matter of stamps, forms, and waiting lines. The command economy collapsed into confusion before markets could stabilize. When central planning broke apart, it did not instantly transform into a smooth market system. It fell into a dangerous middle ground where old rules no longer worked and new rules were not yet trusted. Ministries lost control over production targets, yet businesses often lacked clear prices, secure contracts, or reliable banking. Managers who had once taken orders from above suddenly had to make commercial decisions they had never been trained to make. Shops could be free from one set of restrictions, yet still trapped by shortages, uncertainty, and panic buying. Citizens were told that markets would eventually bring choice and efficiency, but the first experience for many was disorientation. Goods moved erratically. Prices jumped. Wages lost meaning. This period was so jarring because it exposed how much coordination had once depended on command, even when command was flawed. Removing the old structure created space for something new, but it also created a vacuum. In that vacuum, people were forced to improvise their livelihoods while the logic of everyday survival changed faster than they could absorb. Factories lost suppliers, and production chains snapped across new borders. A Soviet factory might rely on parts from another republic, fuel from a third, and transport routes managed by ministries that no longer functioned as before. When the Union dissolved, those links did not politely adjust. They snapped. A plant could still have workers, machines, and orders, yet be missing one crucial component that used to arrive by routine from hundreds of miles away. Suddenly, internal shipments became cross-border trade. Customs rules, tariffs, currency problems, and political mistrust began interfering with industrial life. Managers who had once phoned another Soviet office now had to negotiate with newly foreign partners. This was one reason the economic collapse felt so immediate. It was built into the structure of production itself. The Soviet system had woven the republics together with intricate dependence, and that dependence became fragile once national priorities split apart. A factory floor could look unchanged, yet the invisible network keeping it alive had failed. The silence of idle machinery became one of the sounds of the post-Soviet transition. Pensions and savings were hit by inflation, and security felt stolen. For many ordinary people, the collapse was not first experienced as a debate about ideology or sovereignty. It was experienced as the shrinking value of a lifetime's caution. Pensioners who had saved carefully discovered that money in the bank could erode with terrifying speed. Families who had put aside cash for an apartment, a wedding, or old age watched those plans dissolve into numbers that no longer meant what they once had. Inflation does more than damage budgets. It breaks a moral expectation. People believe that years of work and restraint should buy some future stability. When that bargain fails, the loss feels almost intimate, as if time itself has been taken from them. The shock was especially hard on those with fixed incomes, because they could not quickly reinvent themselves in the new economy. This made the transition emotionally uneven. Some younger or well-connected people found opportunities in chaos. Others felt robbed by it. The collapse of value turned political change into personal grief, measured not in speeches, but in emptied savings books and worried kitchen conversations. Former party elites reinvented themselves, and power changed its clothing. Revolutions often promise a new class of leaders, yet old elites are rarely so easy to erase. Across the former Soviet world, many people who had risen through the Communist Party adapted with surprising speed to the post-Soviet era. They changed rhetoric, embraced new national symbols, or presented themselves as experienced managers who alone could guide society through danger. Some entered parliaments as Democrats. Some became presidents, ministers, or influential business figures. The continuity was not always obvious at first, because the language had changed. Yet behind the speeches stood people who already knew how to navigate bureaucracy, build patronage, and hold networks together. This mattered because it softened the fall for some and distorted the transition for others. New institutions were born, but old habits often staffed them. Citizens hoping for a clean break sometimes discovered familiar faces wearing new political costumes. Power had not vanished. It had rebranded. That created one of the strangest features of the post-Soviet world. The system collapsed, yet many of the people trained by it remained at the center of the stage. State property shifted hands, and privatization began with fierce arguments. Once the Soviet state dissolved, an enormous question followed close behind. Who owns everything that used to belong to everyone? Factories, mines, shops, housing, transport assets, and natural resources could not remain in political limbo forever. Privatization emerged as an answer, yet it quickly became one of the most explosive debates of the era. Supporters argued that private ownership would create responsibility, investment, and efficiency. Critics feared that common wealth built over generations would be snapped up by insiders before ordinary people understood the rules. In many places, both instincts proved partly correct. The transfer of property was not just an economic reform. It was a struggle over justice, speed, and trust. People asked whether ownership should be distributed broadly, sold quickly, or protected from abuse. Those arguments mattered because they shaped the post-Soviet social order. A society can accept hardship more easily if it believes the rules are fair. When people suspect that a national inheritance is being divided behind closed doors, privatization stops sounding like reform and starts sounding like seizure. Crime networks expanded because institutions weakened faster than laws formed. When a state loses control more quickly than a legal order can replace it, space opens for people who thrive in uncertainty. Across the post-Soviet world, criminal networks expanded by exploiting exactly that gap. Police structures were underfunded or compromised. Courts were learning new rules while old protections had vanished. Businesses needed security, contracts, and access to scarce goods, and organized groups stepped in to offer all three at a price. This was not only a story of street violence, though that existed too. It was also a story of influence, protection rackets, smuggling, and shadow finance threading themselves into everyday life. The speed of the change made it especially unsettling. Citizens who had grown up in a tightly controlled society suddenly faced a world where the danger was not only the state, but also the weakness of the state. That reversal altered the emotional atmosphere of public life. Freedom can feel exhilarating. It can also feel exposed. When institutions falter, fear does not disappear. It changes shape and starts wearing a different face. Some cities renamed streets, and language became a daily referendum. After the collapse, politics entered one of the most ordinary parts of life, the address on an envelope. Streets named for revolutionary leaders, party anniversaries, or Soviet heroes were renamed in many places, and each change carried a message about which past would now be honored. Residents had to learn new maps of memory. Shopkeepers changed signs. Children memorized different school addresses. Taxi drivers grumbled, adapted, and then repeated the new names until they felt natural. Yet these changes were not merely administrative. They turned daily speech into a small act of alignment. Which name do you use? Which history do you accept? In multilingual regions, the issue became even sharper, because language itself signaled loyalty, identity, or resistance. A street sign could become a miniature political argument. That is what made renaming so powerful. It brought national transformation down to the scale of a bus route and a return address. The larger battle over the Soviet legacy was being fought not only in parliaments, but in the words people used to navigate their own neighborhoods. Statues were toppled in places, but nostalgia stayed in many homes. Public monuments can fall quickly. Private memory is slower. In some cities, statues of Soviet figures were removed as symbols of repression or unwanted rule. Crowds sometimes celebrated the change because it felt like visible proof that a new era had begun. Yet inside apartments and family homes, feelings were often more complicated. Many people remembered the Soviet period not only through censorship and shortages, but also through youth, stability, military victory, education, or a sense of collective purpose. Nostalgia did not always mean support for the old system. Sometimes it meant longing for predictability, for social guarantees, or simply for a lost world that had once made sense. That emotional mix mattered because it shaped politics long after the collapse. A toppled statue can announce what the state now condemns. It cannot decide what people continue to miss. The post-Soviet landscape was full of this tension. Official memory moved one way, personal memory moved another. Between them stood millions of people trying to sort grief from judgment and history from home. The Soviet anthem lingered in memory, even when the state was gone. An anthem is more than music. It is repetition, ceremony, and the sound of belonging drilled into public life from childhood onward. Even after the Soviet Union disappeared, its anthem remained lodged in memory for millions who had heard it at school events, military ceremonies, sporting occasions, and on national broadcasts. That persistence matters because songs can outlive systems in a way constitutions cannot. A melody can return uninvited, carrying emotions that are older and more tangled than politics alone. For some, the anthem recalled pride and shared sacrifice. For others, it recalled conformity and the pressure of official rituals. Yet even those who rejected the Soviet state could find the music hard to forget, because it had once framed public time itself. Morning announcements, holidays, victories, mourning, all had passed through that sound. In the post-Soviet years, memory often arrived through symbols like flags and statues. It also arrived through music, which could bypass argument and go straight to feeling. The state was gone. The soundtrack for many was not. Many Russians woke up in a new country without ever moving house. For millions of people in Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union did not feel like a journey. It felt like a sudden relabeling of reality. The apartment was the same. The street outside looked the same. The factory, school, or bus stop still stood where it had yesterday. Yet the country had changed around them, and with it came a new flag, new institutions, and a new political story about where they lived. That strangeness is part of what makes the Soviet end so gripping. Most revolutions are imagined as movement, noise, and visible rupture. Here, one of the deepest shocks was stillness. You could boil tea in the same kitchen and still belong to a different state by evening. It forced people to rethink identity in a deeply personal way. Were they Soviet yesterday and Russian today? Had their home changed, or had the meaning of home shifted beneath their feet? That quiet dislocation was one of the most extraordinary human experiences of the collapse. For millions, the fall meant freedom, and also frightening uncertainty. The end of Soviet rule opened doors that had long been locked. People could speak more openly, travel more freely, publish new ideas, build parties, start businesses, and imagine futures that did not pass through a single ideology. That freedom was real, and for many, it felt exhilarating. Yet freedom arrived hand in hand with instability. Old guarantees vanished before new protections were ready. Jobs became less secure. Prices became less predictable. Institutions that had once dominated life also had, in their own rigid way, organized it. When that organization broke down, possibility expanded, but so did fear. This is what makes the moment so compelling. Liberation was not neat. It did not arrive wrapped in comfort. It arrived amid confusion, argument, and improvisation. Some people felt they could finally breathe. Others felt the floor had disappeared beneath them. Most felt both at once. The collapse was not simply a triumph or a tragedy. It was a doorway that opened onto a landscape no one fully knew how to cross. Archival revelations exposed purges and famine, reshaping what citizens believed. When archives began opening more widely, the Soviet past stopped being something managed mainly by official textbooks and approved speeches. Documents emerged that illuminated terror, purges, repression, and famine with a clarity that was hard to dismiss. Lists of names, internal reports, and state correspondence gave weight to stories that families had carried in fragments for decades. The power of this change was enormous. A rumor can be denied. A stamped file is harder to wave away. Citizens who had grown up inside heroic narratives were forced to confront evidence that the state had hidden not only mistakes, but suffering on a vast scale. This did not create one single reaction. Some felt vindicated. Some felt devastated. Some resisted because accepting the truth meant rethinking everything they had been taught about justice, progress, and sacrifice. The archives mattered because they turned memory into documentary fact. They made history feel less distant and more accusatory. In the ruins of the Soviet Union, paper itself became a force that could reorder belief. The space program survived, but funding fell and ambitions narrowed. The Soviet Union had once astonished the world through space, sending the first satellite and the first human into orbit. After the collapse, that legacy did not vanish, but it changed shape. The rockets still mattered, the engineers still mattered, and the knowledge built over decades still mattered. What changed was the scale of ambition that the state could afford. Economic crisis forced painful choices, and dreams that had once been tied to superpower competition now had to survive in a world of tighter budgets and harder bargaining. Space centers and design bureaus entered an era where survival itself became an achievement. Programs were delayed, scaled back, or reimagined through partnerships and practical necessities. There is something deeply moving in that transition. A project born from ideological rivalry had to learn endurance without imperial confidence behind it. The stars were still there, and the technical brilliance was still there, but the political world that had once poured vast resources into reaching them was gone. The heavens remained. The ladder upward became shorter. Scientists emigrated, creating a quiet brain drain from former Soviet labs. When the Soviet system fell apart, it did not only lose territory and institutions, it also began losing minds. Scientists, engineers, and specialists trained in highly advanced fields faced shrinking budgets, uncertain salaries, and research environments that could no longer support their work as before. Many chose to leave, taking positions abroad where laboratories had equipment, funding, and stability. This migration was quieter than a protest or a coup, yet it was one of the most important consequences of the collapse. Years of education, state investment, and technical culture were flowing outward through airports and contracts. Some departures were bittersweet. Researchers were leaving colleagues, languages, and places that had shaped their intellectual lives. Yet staying could mean stagnation or poverty. The loss mattered because knowledge is a form of national strength that cannot be easily replaced once dispersed. A factory can be rebuilt. A scientific community, once scattered, is far harder to restore. The brain drain was a hidden kind of unraveling, measured not in headlines, but in empty desks and interrupted experiments. Some republics moved toward Europe, while others remained tied to Moscow. After the Soviet Union ended, the former republics did not all run in the same direction. Some looked westward and saw opportunity in European institutions, markets, and political models. Others remained more closely linked to Moscow through trade, security, language, or political culture. This divergence gave the post-Soviet world its lasting shape. The old empire had once held very different places inside a single framework. Once that frame disappeared, those differences became pathways. Geography mattered. History mattered. So did elite choices, public opinion, and fear of instability. In some capitals, leaders spoke of integration, reform, and a future anchored beyond the old Soviet sphere. In others, continuity felt safer than rupture, and ties to Russia remained powerful or even desirable. The striking part is how quickly these trajectories began to harden. The breakup did not produce one shared aftermath. It produced multiple futures emerging from the same collapse. That is part of why the Soviet end still fascinates. It was one event, but it sent its successor states into very different historical currents. Regional conflicts erupted because frozen disputes were suddenly unfrozen. Empires often hold tensions in place, not by solving them, but by suppressing them. When the Soviet Union weakened, some of those buried disputes rose to the surface with alarming speed. Boundaries that had once seemed administrative now carried the weight of sovereignty. Communities that had lived with uneasy arrangements suddenly faced the question of which state they belonged to and whether that state would protect them. Once central authority receded, old grievances gained momentum. Local militias formed. Political claims hardened. A conflict that had once been postponed became immediate because the structures postponing it were gone. This made the breakup more dangerous than some outside observers first realized. The Soviet end was not only a story of declarations and flags. It was also a story of places where uncertainty turned violent because compromise had never truly been built. The disputes were called frozen for a reason. They had not disappeared. They had simply been kept still by force and habit. When the larger state cracked, the pressure beneath those fractures pushed upward all at once. The Cold War ended, yet its arsenals and habits endured. When the Soviet Union collapsed, many people hoped the Cold War had ended cleanly, as if one giant drama had closed and a simpler world would follow. In one sense, it had ended. The defining rivalry between two superpower blocs was over. Yet much of its material and mental architecture remained. Nuclear arsenals still existed. Military doctrine still shaped planning. Intelligence services still carried old instincts, and political elites still fought in patterns formed by decades of confrontation. This is one reason the Soviet collapse feels so haunting. A world ended, but not all of its machinery stopped with it. The habits of suspicion, strategic calculation, and great power symbolism remained in circulation, even after the ideology that had animated them weakened or vanished. History did not wipe the board clean. It left behind weapons, memories, institutions, and reflexes. The Cold War ended as a formal contest, yet its afterlife continued in subtler forms. The stage was dismantled, but many of the actors kept wearing pieces of the costume. The Soviet collapse happened without a single decisive battle for Moscow. Many great states in history end with a siege, a last stand, or a battlefield that later generations can point to and say, "There, that was the end." The Soviet Union did not end that way. There was no final army storming Moscow, and no single climactic battle that settled everything in one violent afternoon. Instead, the collapse came through politics, paralysis, negotiation, failed coercion, and the steady transfer of loyalty away from the center. That makes the story more unusual, not less dramatic. It means a superpower unraveled through meetings, decrees, protests, speeches, resignations, and administrative breakdowns, rather than through a conventional war for the capital. The absence of one final battle can make the ending seem abstract, but it was anything but abstract to those living through it. It revealed that states do not always die only from military defeat. They can also die when enough people stop believing, stop obeying, and start building alternatives faster than the old center can suppress them. Moscow remained standing. The system that ruled from it did not. It ended through politics, economics, and identity pulling harder than force. In the end, the Soviet Union was not brought down by a single invasion or one irresistible military strike. It was pulled apart by several immense pressures acting at once. Politics opened space that the old system could no longer fully control. Economic weakness made promises sound thinner each year. National identities once managed within the Union grew stronger as the center grew weaker. Force still existed, and the state still had weapons, police, and institutions built for command. Yet force alone could not solve shortages, restore belief, or persuade republics to remain inside a union they increasingly questioned. That is what makes the ending so remarkable. One of the most heavily armed states on Earth discovered that coercion had limits when legitimacy, money, and shared identity were all failing together. The collapse was therefore not simple and not accidental. It was the cumulative result of different kinds of power moving in opposite directions. The center still had strength. The forces pulling away had become stronger. That is how an empire can end without a single final blow. As we come to the end of our journey tonight, we can look back across the final years of the Soviet Union and see just how extraordinary they were. We have wandered through a world of crumbling ministries, rising republics, shifting flags, crowded streets, and voices that could no longer be forced back into silence. We have watched a superpower strain under economic pressure, political fracture, and the steady return of identities that had never truly disappeared. We have seen tanks in city squares, debates on live television, borders redrawn, and old certainties dissolve into something new and unknown. And yet now, with all of that behind us, the story can begin to soften. The speeches can fade. The banners can lower. The long queues, the echoing chambers of government, the winter streets, and the vast map of a changing world can drift gently into the distance. Let it all become quieter now in your mind, like footsteps fading across snow, or the last light dimming in faraway windows. Thank you for spending this time here with me on the Sleepy History Channel. If you enjoyed this journey, I would love for you to like, subscribe, or leave a thought below. And if you happen to still be awake, there will be another video waiting for you on screen, ready to carry you onward into another chapter of the past. But for now, let your breathing grow slow and steady. Let your thoughts loosen their grip. Let the weight of the day sink away, little by little, as history settles and the night grows deeper around you. Sleep well, and good night.